and Assalamu alaikum. This is Oishi representing Bangladeshi Asexuals Association. I will be presenting on Islam, queerness, and asexuality. Our main interest is to discuss asexuality in the Islamic context. But before we can do that, it is necessary to explore the historical and contemporary context of Islam and gender, queerness, sexuality, and marriage. The sources used for this presentation are listed at the end of this presentation. The organizers will try to make the links available to you after the presentation. Before getting started, I would like to issue a blanket content warning. I will be discussing sensitive topics, including but not limited to homophobia, transphobia, acephobia, and abuse. To begin the discussion on Islam and gender, I'd like to start by saying that in Islam, God is genderless. God, or Allah, is strictly singular, unique, with no body or gender. In Arabic, conventionally, the pronoun used for Allah when referring to Allah in the third person is huwa, which is grammatically male, and it does not imply masculinity. In fact, in the Quran, God is referred to by 99 other names, some of which have feminine roots. For example, Ar-Rahman is derived from the word Rahm, meaning womb. Gender is seen as a human characteristic, not to be applied to the divine. And by that token, all humans are viewed through a strict gendered lens. Men and women have strict gender roles in Islam. The roles, rights, and responsibilities of Muslims are based on their gender. Men have explicit responsibilities to their families and the community. They have to provide for their family. They have duties to the mosque and the community leaders. Women's responsibilities are defined within the domestic sphere. Their main responsibility is to take care of the children, and the role of the mother is highly venerated in Islam. Men are awarded guardianship or kiwama over the family, and women are expected to follow the men's kiwama. The laws governing marriage, divorce, and inheritance are also based on gender. Thus, gender is very important in Islam. Despite this, there are records from the Prophet's time making references to the mukhannathun, which loosely translates to effeminate men who did not strictly adhere to these strict gendered roles. Reports say that they worked in the households under the women, which would be traditional feminine roles. And reports also say that the women of the household were lax in their observance of the veil around the mukhannathun than they were around other men. There are a few references to the mukhannathun in the hadith, which are the collection of the Prophet's teachings and Prophet's life. In one such hadith, there was an account of a mukhannath who was charged with deviant behavior for dyeing hands and feet with henna. Although the mukhannathun were recognized to be effeminate, presumably dyeing hands and feet with henna crossed a line into behavior that was considered too feminine for someone who was considered to be a man. So much so the society was offended enough that they wanted to kill the mukhannath, but the Prophet forbade killing any Muslim who prayed and advocated for banishment rather than outright death. After the death of the Prophet, during the Rashidun Caliphate, the mukhannathun were performers and were associated with music and entertainment. However, during the next caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, the second caliph, Marwan ibn al-Hakam, declared them unholy, and they have been ostracized ever since. In present day, attitudes towards transgender issues vary. One of the key problems faced by transgender individuals is that they pose a threat to the strict gender roles defined by Islam. And some scholars advocate for gender reassignment surgery as a way to reduce the deviance so people can stick to one gender role or the other. The most famous of these or the fatwa or the ruling issued by Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in 1987, which made gender reassignment surgery legal. When exploring Islam and sexuality from a historical and theological context, we find some elements that are sex positive and some that are quite sex negative. So for example, the Hadith emphasized the right to enjoy sex for both men and women. It emphasizes the importance of consent and even encourages foreplay as a way of enjoying sex. Sex was not seen solely as a means of procreation because withdrawal method was encouraged for people who wanted to have sex without conceiving. In Islam, celibacy is heavily discouraged. In the Prophet's time, there were frank and open discussions about sex, and there are even biographical accounts of the Prophet's sex lives with his wives. That being said, sex outside marriage is considered to be zina, an illegal punishable offense. This is whether it's premarital or extramarital. Homosexuality, by that token, is considered to be zina or adultery under all Islamic fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence. The legal punishment for homosexuality's sake is a later colonial import. Under Islamic fiqh, it was punishable as adultery. The Quranic story of Prophet Lut, which is the same story as the biblical prophet Lot, is often brought up in relation to Islam's attitude towards homosexuality. In this story, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were punished for their sins, and many cite that the sin was homosexuality. However, they ignore that the story talks about their list of other offenses, including profligacy, promiscuity, decadence, mistreatment of travelers, sexual assault, rape, and even pedophilia. Thus, to say that they had incurred the wrath solely due to sodomy is inaccurate. If we look at the Islamic scholarship from the Middle Ages and the pre-colonial era, it's surprising to see how much emphasis there was on the sex positive. There were extensive works on sex, sexuality, and sexology in Islamic scholarship. For example, there's the 10th century Encyclopedia of Pleasure by the Baghdadi physician Ali ibn Nasr al-Khatib. There are distinct erotic tones and homoerotic undertones in the works of 10th century Arab classical poet Abu Nuwas and 13th century Persian mystic Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi, commonly known as Rumi. The 15th century Egyptian religious scholar Al-Suyuti wrote at least 23 tomes on sex and sexuality. It's believed that in private circles, the attitudes towards queerness were more tolerant than in public circles. However, it was enough that Europeans used to view Islamic societies as depraved societies. Starting from the mid-19th century, there was a major shift in attitude. This is as the European colonial powers grew and Islamic nations started to become colonized by them. Islamic scholars with fundamental views adopted the mindset that European domination was a punishment for their lax morality. During this time, many colonial practices were adopted. For example, it was the British Raj who created the Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, under which to these days, queerness is criminalized in all South Asian countries. And all the scholarly works I mentioned on Islamic sexology and the works on sex and sexuality were eventually rooted out and banned by intellectuals, government officials, and cultural gatekeepers. For example, the Abu Nuwas poetry I mentioned was burned by the Egyptian Ministry of Culture as recently as 2001. Sex and sexuality have become taboo topics in Islamic countries. Little to no formal sex education exists in these countries, and little to no traces left of the sex positive and queer aspects of Islamic history. Before proceeding further, let me provide some background information on the regional differences in Islam. Islam is inherently influenced by Middle Eastern and Arab culture, given this is where the religion originated. Elements of this culture were also spread along with the religion, sometimes making it difficult to isolate which aspects are inherently Islamic and which aspects are coming from Arab culture. However, as Islam spread, local culture also contributed to regional differences. And these could have been influences from existing religious customs. For example, Hinduism in South Asia influenced practices in that region. And Christian missionaries and colonial power also influenced the ways in which Islam was practiced in other regions to which it spread. But broadly speaking, there are two main branches in Islam, Sunni and Shia. And within each branch, there are several different schools of thought, each with its own jurisprudence or fiqh, which dictates how Muslim must lead their life according to the Islamic jurisprudence. Now let's discuss marriage in Islam. The Arabic word for marriage is nikah. Nikah is a legal contract. It may be verbal or on paper, although in modern days it's exclusively on paper. It requires spoken or gestured consent. The bride and groom must both say or indicate qubul, which is the consent. And 2 witnesses are required to make this contract valid. During the marriage, the groom must pay a dower payment known as mahr to the bride, and the groom is henceforth obligated to provide financial support or nafaka to the wife. Men are permitted to marry any woman from the people of the book, which refers to Christians or Jews, but women are only permitted to marry Muslim men. This stems from the fact that fathers are supposed to be passing down the religion to the son or daughter. Inheritance laws and divorce laws can take many different forms, but they also have the gender asymmetry, which means the laws are not applied equally to, or the laws are not applied in the same way to men and women. These are the basics of how marriage is practiced in Islam, but there are some regional differences. I'd like to discuss 2 regional practices in Islam that arose. The first is nikah muta, or a temporary marriage. This was legal in the Prophet's time, but it was outlawed by the second Caliph Umar during the Rashidun Caliphate. But it is still practiced in some Imamiya Shia communities today as a form of halal dating or permissible dating. And by signing a contract, 2 people are free to date each other and explore their relationship with each other how they wish before they decide to commit to nikah. And they may decide not to commit at the end of the temporary marriage. The inheritance laws do not apply, but the progeny, the potential progeny from this marriage are considered legitimate. This practice is, however, very controversial because it is being abused in some areas as a cover for prostitution, even child prostitution. Another form of marriage that was practiced at a certain point in time was the misir marriage or the traveler's marriage. It was designed to circumvent adultery among those who traveled for work. So if a man wished to marry somebody while he is away for an extended period of time for work, he may choose to have a traveler's marriage in which certain marital rights are renounced, such as the obligation for financial support or the guardianship of the family. However, this form of marriage is not legally recognized in modern times. We've discussed that there is gender asymmetry when it comes to marriage, and there are also differences in sexual rights. For example, polygamy is permitted in Islam, but specifically polygyny, which means men are permitted to practice polygamy. Men are allowed up to 4 wives under condition of equal treatment of all wives and consent from all parties involved. However, in modern days, this practice is banned or restricted in most Islamic nations. Controversially, concubinage, a form of slavery, was also permitted in Islam, but it is banned today everywhere. Female genital mutilation is another issue that many women in Islamic countries suffer from. This is practiced in some African and Middle Eastern communities in an attempt to control female sexuality. However, it's not restricted to Muslim communities. Many in Christian communities also suffer from this problem, but there is no religious basis in either Islam or Christianity for this practice. Queerness continues to be a controversial issue in Islamic circles. However, there are some recent movements trying to bring these issues to light. Films such as A Jihad for Love highlights the struggles of LGBTQ Muslims. There are organizations that are advocating for inclusivity. For example, the US-based Muslims for Progressive Values and the Light of Reform Mosque. In the UK, there is the Inclusive Mosque, and there is also the Global Alliance of Inclusive Muslims. There are many imams, such as Imam Dai Abdullah of Washington, D.C., Imam Muhsin Hendricks of Cape Town, South Africa, and Imam Ludovic Mohammed Zahid of Paris, France, who identify with different sexualities and are inclusive of Muslims of different sexualities. They advocate for alternate interpretations, flexibility, and ijtihad, which is the concept of independent reasoning. The basis for this advocacy is that many current practices, such as the misyar marriage that I discussed previously, are a result of flexible interpretation. These advocacies are, however, very controversial among traditional schools of thought. And also, there is little to no advocacy for issues faced by Muslims in the A-spectrums. Now let us discuss Islam and asexuality. In Islam, there is a strong assumption of compulsory sexuality. Muslims are taught that when a man and a woman are alone in a room, shaitan or the devil is the third person in their company. The assumption is that they must be facing a lot of temptation in each other's company and they're going to get up to no good. This leads to strict gender segregation in many Islamic communities. The legalization of premarital and extramarital sex via muta and misyar were possible because of the belief in compulsory sexuality. Because people believed that Muslims might give in to temptation because they wanted to control adultery, which is illegal. That is why they created these legalizations as a way to circumvent adultery. However, as I said, these practices are not common in most Islamic nations, but what is common is that early marriage is very encouraged in order to avoid premarital relations. As I've discussed previously, celibacy is heavily discouraged and even considered unnatural and abnormal. Arabs were familiar with the concept of celibacy from Christianity, which was practiced in many parts of the Arab world during the Prophet's time. And in contrast with Christianity, celibacy was heavily discouraged. It's believed to have been prohibited by the Prophet. Marriage is considered to be sunnah, which is a recommended practice following the practices of the Prophet himself. Marriage is considered to be essential for a Muslim's deen, for a Muslim's Islamic way of life. This is not surprising that marriage and procreation were heavily encouraged because early Islamic societies very much wanted to expand population growth and expand Islam to other regions of the world. However, procreation was not the only function of sex. Satisfying a spouse's sexual needs is an essential marital duty for both men and women. Failure to do so was valid grounds for divorce, even in societies where divorce was permissible only when there were valid reasons presented. There are some alternate views on celibacy, however. Here I will read a quote from early Sufi authority, Abu Talib al-Maki. God has decreed neither marriage nor celibacy, but he has decreed integrity of heart, preservation of faith, a soul at peace, and the execution of commands needed for these. And if one's healthful condition, integrity of heart, and peace of soul reside in celibacy, then that is better for him, since these are the things that are desired of marriage. If one can reach these without marriage, then celibacy causes no harm. Perhaps in Sufism, celibacy was viewed more positively. The first female Sufi saint, Rabia al-Adawiya, also known as Rabia Basri, was single and independent. She detached herself from all other desires but the love of God, and she was a spiritual leader of both men and women. Next, I will discuss two potentially asexual historic figures identified by Muslim ace activist Laura. The first is Sauda bin Zama, one of the wives of the Prophet. On the brink of divorce for her lack of interest in sex, she negotiated staying in the marriage by giving her day and night to another wife. For context, the Prophet used to spend equal amount of time with his wives, and Sauda bin Zama was able to ask him to spend more time with his other wives in exchange for staying married to her, which she may have wanted for reasons such as security. The second example is Rabia bint Ismail, also a Sufi mystic, but not to be confused with Rabia Basri. Rabia bint Ismail was married, but she reportedly encouraged her husband to take more wives because she did not love him the way married couples do. These women were identified to be potentially asexual because they expressly stated their lack of interest in sex. It's also important to note that their marriages were possible due to the tradition of polygyny in Islam. From a theological perspective, asexuality is not addressed in the Quran or the Hadith or in any Islamic scholarly works, except for one fatwa or scholarly ruling by Dr. Hatem al-Hajj. He says that lack of sexual desire or drive is not sinful. Marriage is mandatory only in the presence of temptation to engage in illicit sexual relations. One who lacks such a drive may not marry without letting the other partner know of his or her condition. This fatwa is not well known among Muslim communities where first of all, there is not much awareness about asexuality. And second of all, everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation, is pressured to get married. In some cases, conditions such as asexuality are not understood, and even if they were, these will probably be kept a secret before marriage, unlike what the fatwa is suggesting. For asexual individuals and aromantic individuals, the view of marriage as essential in many communities can prove to be a big problem. Marriage is viewed as an essential duty to the society and family. It is important social currency for the family because marriages are arranged keeping wealth and status in mind. It's considered to be a parent's duty to ensure good marriages for their children, and unmarried children are seen as a disgrace to their families. This creates tremendous pressure on young people to get married or to give in to their parents' pressure to get married. In some instances, many are forced into marriages. We could not find statistics for the prevalence of forced marriages in Islamic countries, but we did find some statistics for the cases handled in 2018 by the UK-based forced marriage unit. These are the number of cases, the percentage of cases they dealt with in various countries. Many of them are Islamic countries, but I would emphasize once again that these numbers do not represent the actual prevalence of forced marriage in these countries, and some countries might be missing from this list. The data is very difficult. Data on forced marriage is very difficult to collect. However, it's very unfortunate that forced marriages are so prevalent, despite the emphasis of the importance of consent in Islam. Another issue many Islamic countries are struggling with is marital rape. Rape is considered to be a serious sexual crime under all Islamic schools of thought, and definitely a punishable offense. But marital right is not recognized in most Muslim countries. Marriage is considered to be implied consent, and people are expected to make themselves available sexually to their spouses at all times. Women are taught that they will be cursed by the angels if they withhold sex from their husbands. On top of that, men are awarded the right to discipline their wife's recalcitrance, not specifically withholding of sex, but they are, given that they are the guardian of the family, they have the right to discipline if the wife is recalcitrant in any way. This practice is heavily discouraged, but it is technically permissible. All of this create obstacles for legal protection against marital rape. Even though there is emphasis in Islam on not causing harm to anyone, we can only infer that marital rape is not allowed. There is no explicit ban on marital rape. And with that, we've come to the end of the presentation, where I end with some open questions. What are the options for ACEs whose families insist they must get married even if they do not wish to? What about ACEs who wish to get married of their own volition for reasons other than sex? Is there potential for them to negotiate in the marriage contract that they are not obligated to make themselves available for sex at all times? What are the options for ACEs whose societies discourage any discussion of sex? How can they discover their sexuality if they're not allowed to question it or discuss it with others? What are the options for anyone whose societies do not offer legal protection from marital rape? With these questions, I end today's presentation. I hope that these conversations will continue to happen, and with enough progress, you will have answers to these questions. As mentioned before, the sources are all listed at the end of the presentation, and the organizers will try to make them available to you after the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.